The self versus no-self, Jung versus Buddha, who was right? What if everything you believe about yourself, your name, your memories, your personality, your ambitions, is nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion? What if the self you cling to so desperately, the identity you've spent years shaping, isn't as solid as you think? This idea isn't just a philosophical puzzle, it's a question that has haunted the greatest minds in history. From ancient sages to modern neuroscientists, from Eastern mystics to Western psychologists, the nature of the self has been one of the deepest mysteries of human existence. Two of the most profound thinkers to tackle this enigma were Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, and Gautama Buddha. The awakened sage of ancient India, Jung believed that the self was the key to psychological integration. He taught that we must embrace and unify all aspects of our being, the conscious and unconscious, the light and the shadow, to achieve true wholeness. Buddha, on the other hand, arrived at a radical realization: there is no permanent, unchanging self to unify in the first place. Instead, he taught that our suffering comes from clinging to a false sense of identity, from believing in an illusion that does not truly exist. At first glance, these two perspectives seem to be in direct contradiction. One urges us to build the self, the other urges us to let it go. One sees the self as the key to fulfillment. The other sees it as the root of suffering. But what if these ideas are not as opposed as they seem? What if, instead of choosing between them, we could use both to unlock a deeper understanding of who we are, and more importantly, who we are not? Modern science is now catching up to these ancient insights. Neuroscientists have discovered that there is no single self inside the brain, only a network of constantly shifting thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. Buddhist meditation practices have been shown to deactivate the default mode network, DMN, the part of the brain responsible for self-referential thinking, leading to experiences of profound peace and egolessness. Jung's ideas about the unconscious mind parallel Buddha's teachings about the illusion of self. Both recognize that what we think of as me is just a collection of mental patterns shaped by conditioning, culture, and experience. So, what does this mean for you? Should you strive to build a strong self or dissolve it completely? Should you seek wholeness or transcendence? And most importantly, how can understanding these two perspectives help you break free from suffering, anxiety, and the limitations of identity? In today's exploration, we're going to unravel the profound truths behind Jung's self and Buddha's no-self, uncovering how these insights can transform the way you see yourself and live your life. Stay with me until the end, you won't look at yourself the same way again. Part 1: How Jung discovered Eastern thought. Jung's journey into Eastern thought was not merely academic, it was a revelation, a tectonic shift in his understanding of the human psyche. Before encountering the wisdom of the East, Jung had been deeply rooted in the Western tradition of psychology, shaped by Freud's emphasis on the unconscious as a repository of repressed desires. But something about this framework felt incomplete to him. There were patterns, symbols, and experiences in his patient's dreams that could not be explained through Freud's theories alone. And so, when he first came across the mystical philosophies of Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism, it was as if he had stumbled upon a long-lost piece of a cosmic puzzle. His introduction to these ideas came through his encounter with Richard Wilhelm, a German sinologist and theologian who had spent years in China immersing himself in Eastern thought. Wilhelm's deep knowledge of Taoism and Confucianism, combined with his translation of the I Ching, gave Jung an entirely new perspective on the psyche. Here was a system of thought that did not simply analyze human behavior but sought to harmonize the inner and outer worlds. In contrast to the Western obsession with control and categorization, the East embraced paradox, fluidity, and the dissolution of rigid ego boundaries. But what truly captivated Jung was the realization that the symbols appearing in his patients' unconscious minds, serpents, mandalas, celestial beings, were not merely personal constructs. They were universal, appearing in Eastern religious art, scriptures, and meditative visions. The mandala, in particular, struck him as a profound representation of the psyche's journey toward wholeness. In Buddhist and Hindu traditions, mandalas were sacred geometric representations of the cosmos and the self, used as meditation tools to attain spiritual enlightenment. In Jung's own practice, his patients spontaneously drew mandalas in their search for healing, without ever having encountered them before. How was this possible? This realization led Jung to develop his theory of the collective unconscious, a vast, inherited reservoir of symbols, archetypes, and mythic structures shared by all of humanity. And yet, the more he studied Eastern texts, the more he questioned whether his theories were truly new. The Buddha had spoken of illusion, suffering, and liberation through the dissolution of the ego. Taoist sages had described the natural unfolding of the mind in harmony with the Tao. Had Eastern philosophy already mapped the human unconscious centuries before modern psychology was born? Jung's encounter with the Tibetan Book of the Dead was another turning point. This ancient Buddhist text described the journey of the soul through the bardo, the transitional state between death and rebirth, where the self dissolves and encounters visions that reflect its deepest fears and desires. To Jung, this was not merely a religious belief but a profound psychological truth. He saw the bardo experience as a metaphor for the transformations that occur within the psyche during intense introspection, crisis, or deep analysis. The dissolution of the ego, the confrontation with inner demons, the emergence of radiant wisdom, these were not just spiritual states, but psychological necessities for growth and individuation. In 1929, Jung was invited to write the foreword to Wilhelm's translation of The Secret of the Golden Flower, a Taoist meditation manual that described a process of inner alchemy, using visualization and breathwork to refine consciousness and achieve enlightenment. Jung was stunned. The text described, in symbolic terms, a process identical to the individuation journey he had spent years articulating. The Taoist method of turning the light around to observe the mind's nature was strikingly similar to the way analytical psychology guided patients toward self-awareness. And yet, despite these profound connections, Jung also wrestled with the fundamental differences between his approach and that of the East. The Buddha had taught that the self was an illusion, a mere construct that should be transcended in order to attain liberation. Jung, on the other hand, believed in the process of integrating the self, bringing unconscious aspects into conscious awareness to achieve psychological wholeness. At first, this seemed like a contradiction. But as he delved deeper, Jung began to see that both paths, self-realization and self-dissolution, were not opposites, but complementary. The East sought to break the illusion of self, while Jung sought to make the self whole. But in the end, both aimed at the same goal, freedom from suffering, a profound inner awakening. Jung's explorations of Eastern philosophy would go on to influence not only his own work but also the entire field of depth psychology. He paved the way for the integration of meditation, mindfulness, and spiritual practices into modern psychotherapy. But perhaps his greatest insight was this: what he had discovered through psychology, the East had already known for centuries. The unconscious was not just a place of repressed desires, it was a sacred space, a gateway to enlightenment. Part 2, Buddha's revolutionary insight, the illusion of self. The Buddha's insight into the illusion of self was not just a philosophical abstraction, it was a direct confrontation with the deepest fears and assumptions of the human mind. The idea that I exist as a separate, continuous entity is so fundamental to human experience that questioning it feels almost unnatural. And yet, 2,500 years ago, beneath the shade of the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha Gautama dismantled this very illusion, not through blind faith, but through direct, penetrating observation. For centuries before the Buddha's time, the prevailing wisdom across many traditions, whether the Vedic teachings of India or the philosophical musings of Greece, spoke of an eternal self. A soul, Atman, that persists beyond birth and death. This belief comforted people, offering a sense of permanence in a transient world. But Buddha saw things differently. Through deep meditation, he observed that everything we associate with the self, our body, our thoughts, our emotions, was in a constant state of change. He realized that the very notion of a fixed identity was nothing more than an illusion, an artificial construct woven together by fleeting experiences. To explain this, he introduced the doctrine of anatta, or no self. Unlike Hinduism, which described the self as an unchanging essence, and unlike Western dualistic philosophies that framed the soul as separate from the body, Buddha saw no such division. Instead, he broke down human experience into 5 constantly shifting components, known as the 5 aggregates: skandhas form, rupa, the physical body, which is subject to decay, aging, and death. The body we call ours today is completely different from the one we had as a child. Sensation, vedana, feelings of pleasure, pain, and neutrality, which arise and vanish depending on external conditions. Perception, sana, the process of labeling and interpreting sensory input, which fluctuates based on past experiences and present stimuli. Mental formations, sankhara, habits, emotions, thoughts, and predispositions, which constantly shift based on karma and conditioning. Consciousness, via, the awareness that arises in response to sensory inputs, which disappears the moment we fall into deep sleep or unconsciousness. These aggregates, he taught, are like swirling currents in a river, constantly moving, never the same from one moment to the next. And yet, out of this impermanence, we fabricate the illusion of a permanent I. To challenge his followers' attachment to selfhood, the Buddha used one of the most famous analogies in history. If you take apart a chariot, removing its wheels, axles, and frame, where is the chariot? It does not exist as a singular entity, only as a temporary arrangement of parts. Likewise, if you break down your body, feelings, and thoughts, where is the real you? At first, this realization can feel unsettling. If there is no permanent self, then who is experiencing life? Who is making decisions? Who is responsible for past actions? But rather than leaving his disciples in existential uncertainty, the Buddha used this insight to guide them toward liberation. The illusion of self is not just a harmless misperception, it is the very source of human suffering. We suffer because we cling to things as if they are me or mine. We grasp at youth, but time steals it away. We attach to people, but they change or leave. We define ourselves by our thoughts, but they shift with experience. The Buddha saw that attachment to this false identity was the reason humans experience fear, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. History is filled with stories of suffering rooted in identity. Take the story of Emperor Ashoka, one of history's most powerful rulers. As a young king, Ashoka waged brutal wars, believing that his might and conquest defined him. But after witnessing the immense suffering he had caused, he underwent a profound transformation. He realized that his attachment to power, to the identity of a conqueror, had only led to misery, for himself and his people. Inspired by the Buddha's teachings, he renounced violence and dedicated his reign to compassion and wisdom. He understood that the ego-driven self was nothing but a mirage, and in letting it go, he found peace. In modern psychology, we see similar insights emerging. Neuroscientists have found that what we call the self is actually a construct of the brain, piecing together fragmented experiences to create a narrative of continuity. Studies on meditation have shown that when people enter deep states of awareness, the sense of I dissolves, leaving only pure experience. This aligns perfectly with the Buddha's teachings, 2,500 years before neuroscience even existed. Once we accept that the self is an illusion, a remarkable thing happens: fear disappears. Fear of death, fear of failure, fear of losing what we love, these fears exist because we believe there is something fixed and permanent to lose. But if the self is merely a collection of impermanent processes, then what is there to protect? What is there to cling to? Zen Buddhism takes this idea even further. In Zen koans, students are often asked paradoxical questions to shatter their attachment to the self. A famous one is, before you were born, what was your original face? This question is meant to break the mind's habitual clinging to identity. If you look deeply, you will find that the self you identify with today is not the same as the one from 10 years ago. And if you keep looking, you may realize there was never a fixed self to begin with, only a series of passing moments. This is why, when the Buddha attained enlightenment, he did not claim to have gained something new. Instead, he had simply let go of the greatest illusion of all. He saw the truth, that there was nothing to grasp, because there was no one to grasp it. And so, he smiled. This is the key to liberation. Not through struggle, not through seeking, but through seeing things as they really are. When we stop clinging to the self, we stop suffering. When we stop suffering, we find peace. And in that peace, we awaken. Part 3, Jung's self versus Buddha's no-self, are they really opposites? Jung's exploration of the self was not about solidifying an unchanging identity, but about integrating the fragmented parts of the psyche into a dynamic, evolving whole. He saw the process of individuation, the journey toward psychological wholeness, as a way of embracing the unconscious, understanding our inner archetypes, and transcending the false ego. His self was not a rigid construct but an ever-unfolding realization of one's deepest nature. On the other hand, Buddha's teaching of anatta, or no-self, was not a denial of experience, but a dismantling of the illusion of a fixed personal identity. He observed that what we call self is nothing more than a collection of impermanent phenomena, the body. Sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, all arising and passing away moment by moment. The suffering comes from clinging to these fleeting elements, mistaking them for something solid and permanent. So, are these two perspectives truly at odds? Or are they two sides of the same coin? Jung's individuation process and Buddha's path to enlightenment both involve deep self-exploration. Jung saw the unconscious as a vast, mysterious force within us, filled with forgotten memories, suppressed desires, and universal symbols, what he called archetypes. Among these, the persona, the mask we present to the world, and the shadow, the repressed parts of ourselves, play a crucial role. To reach psychological wholeness, one must confront and integrate the shadow, bringing the unconscious into conscious awareness. Buddha, in a strikingly similar way, urged his followers to investigate the nature of their minds. Through meditation, they observed their thoughts, emotions, and attachments, only to realize that these, too, were impermanent and conditioned. Just as Jungian therapy helps individuals see through their false self-images, Buddhist practice helps meditators see through the illusion of self altogether. An interesting parallel can be drawn from history. Take the case of Milarepa, one of Tibet's greatest yogis. In his youth, he was driven by hatred and vengeance, using black magic to destroy his enemies. But when he encountered his teacher, Marpa, he was forced to confront the darkness within himself. Through years of harsh trials and deep meditation, he underwent a complete transformation, transcending his destructive identity and realizing the nature of no-self. His journey mirrors Jung's individuation. By facing his inner demons, he became whole, not by reinforcing his ego, but by dissolving it. Even in modern psychology, we find echoes of this truth. Neuroscientists have discovered that the brain constructs a sense of self through constant prediction and feedback loops. When we look deeply, we see that our identity is not fixed, it is a fluid, ever-changing narrative. Jung understood this on a psychological level, while Buddha saw it as the key to spiritual liberation. In essence, Jung mapped the path toward inner wholeness, while Buddha revealed the ultimate freedom beyond the self. One speaks to the human need for integration, the other, to the transcendence of all illusions. And perhaps, the true paradox is this: only by integrating the self do we come to see that it was never really there to begin with. Part 4, the story of a man who found freedom. David's journey was not just a path of self-discovery, it was a confrontation with everything he had ever believed about himself, a slow and painful shedding of illusions that had defined his existence. For most of his life, he had been running, chasing success, validation, and an ever-distant sense of fulfillment. He had built a life that others envied, a thriving business, a reputation of strength and confidence, a family that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Yet, when he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, a quiet, gnawing emptiness filled him. It was as if something deep inside him was broken, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Desperate for answers, David turned to Jungian therapy, hoping to fix himself. But what he found was far more unsettling. The deeper he looked, the more he realized that the person he had always believed himself to be was nothing more than a collection of past experiences, societal conditioning, and subconscious fears. Jung's concept of the shadow shook him to his core. He had always seen himself as a strong, confident leader, someone who took charge, who always had the answers. But in therapy, he was forced to confront the hidden parts of himself, the insecurity, the suppressed grief, the fear of not being enough. These were aspects of himself that he had buried so deeply. He had almost forgotten they existed. Slowly, he started integrating them. He saw that his relentless drive for success was not a natural ambition but a response to childhood wounds, a desperate attempt to prove his worth, to be seen, to be enough. He realized that so much of his personality, his habits, his ambitions, even his desires, were not truly his own but were shaped by the expectations of others. Jung taught him that the self was not just the ego but something deeper, something that lay beyond the stories he had told himself his whole life. But even as he began to embrace this deeper self, something still felt incomplete. He had understood his mind, but he had not yet learned to let it go. That was when he turned to Buddhism. At first, the idea of meditation seemed foreign to him. He had spent his whole life thinking, analyzing, controlling. How could simply sitting in silence do anything? But as he practiced, he started to see the truth behind Buddha's teachings. At first, his thoughts overwhelmed him. Every insecurity, every fear, every unresolved emotion rose to the surface. He realized that his mind was never still. It was like a storm, endlessly generating thoughts, worries, and desires. But something strange happened the more he watched his thoughts. He started to see them as just thoughts. Not truths. Not reality. Just fleeting patterns of the mind. And then came the most shocking realization of all: there was no fixed David experiencing these thoughts. There were only thoughts, arising and disappearing, like waves on an ocean. This was what Buddha had taught 2,500 years ago, the illusion of self. David had spent his whole life trying to define himself, to build a sense of identity. But what if there was nothing solid to define in the first place? What if his suffering came not from who he was, but from his attachment to the idea of a fixed self? Buddha compared the self to a chariot. If you take a chariot apart, removing the wheels, the axles, the seat, where is the chariot? It was never a single thing, only a collection of parts. David saw this clearly now. His body, his thoughts, his memories, none of them were him. They were constantly changing, impermanent, like the wind shifting through the trees. The businessman, the husband, the leader, these were just roles he had played, not something he was. If there was no fixed self, then who was there to suffer? Who was there to feel anxious? One day, while on a silent meditation retreat, David experienced a moment of profound clarity. Sitting beneath an old oak tree, he felt something within him dissolve, a weight he had been carrying his entire life without realizing it. The need to be someone. The need to prove himself. The need to control. In that moment, there was nothing left to protect, nothing left to fear. There was just this, the rustling of the leaves, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the simple awareness of existence. When he returned to his life, nothing had changed, yet everything had. He still ran his business. He still played his roles. But now, he did it without attachment. Success and failure no longer defined him. Praise and criticism passed through him like the breeze. He was no longer trying to be someone, he simply was. David's journey showed him something profound. Jung and Buddha were not opposites, but two parts of the same path. Jung helped him integrate his psyche, to understand the depths of his unconscious mind. Buddha helped him let go of the very idea of a fixed self, dissolving the illusions that bound him to suffering. One led him to wholeness. The other led him beyond it. And in the end, he didn't just find freedom, he realized that he had never been trapped to begin with. Part 5, The Ego Trap, How Our Identity Becomes Our Prison. The ego is a master illusionist, weaving a narrative so convincing that we mistake it for reality. It whispers to us from childhood, shaping our perceptions, molding our desires, and crafting an identity we come to cherish and defend. But what if this identity, the very thing we rely on to give life meaning, is nothing more than a prison? Jung saw the ego as a necessary structure, a psychological scaffolding that allows us to navigate the world. But he also warned of its dangers. When we become too identified with our ego, we mistake it for the entirety of who we are. This creates a fragile self, one that constantly needs validation. One that fears anything that threatens its carefully constructed image. The businessman who cannot separate himself from his success, the artist who sees rejection as a personal failure, the philosopher who clings to his beliefs so tightly that he refuses to entertain new ideas, these are all prisoners of the ego. Buddha, 2,500 years before Jung, diagnosed this condition with remarkable precision. He called it attavada, or self-view, the mistaken belief that we are a fixed, independent self. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha compared this attachment to a dog tied to a post. The dog may feel free as it moves within its small radius, but in reality, it is bound, trapped within an invisible cage of its own assumptions. The ego, too, operates within a confined space. It can expand, take on new roles, and even become more refined, but it remains a limitation, a barrier between us and true liberation. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the harder we cling to identity, the more fragile it becomes. The moment we define ourselves by success, we invite the fear of failure. If we define ourselves by our relationships, we set ourselves up for suffering when they inevitably change. Even our most cherished beliefs, when turned into rigid aspects of identity, become walls that keep us from growing. This is why Buddha described attachment as the root of suffering. It is not life itself that causes pain, but our resistance to its impermanence. But here's where Jung and Buddha offer different solutions to the same problem. Jung's answer was individuation, the process of integrating the unconscious and conscious mind. Embracing all aspects of the psyche, and moving toward wholeness. He saw the ego not as an enemy but as something that must be understood and expanded. Individuation is a journey, not of dissolving the self, but of making it more complete. In Jung's view, a fully realized person is one who has accepted their contradictions, faced their inner darkness, and emerged with a strong, yet flexible, sense of identity. Buddha, on the other hand, went beyond integration, he pointed toward dissolution. His teaching of anatta, no self, was not about refining the ego but about seeing through its illusion entirely. The self, he taught, is like a river. We can point to it and name it, but it is never the same from one moment to the next. The molecules of water are constantly shifting, just as our thoughts, emotions, and experiences change moment by moment. There is no single, fixed entity to hold on to, only a process unfolding in time. The story of the Zen master Bankei illustrates this beautifully. One day, a samurai came to him, frustrated by his own anger. "Master, I have a terrible temper. No matter how much I try, I cannot control it. How do I get rid of it?" Bankei looked at him and said, "Show me your anger." The samurai, confused, replied, "I cannot show it to you right now. It arises unexpectedly." Then, Bankei said, "It cannot be part of your true self. If it were truly yours, you could bring it out whenever you wished. Let it go." This is the essence of both Jung and Buddha's insights. What we think of as self is not fixed. Jung sought to integrate its many parts, Buddha sought to free us from its illusion. One path leads to wholeness, the other to emptiness, but both lead to liberation. Part 6, The Science of Identity, What Neuroscience Says About the Self. Neuroscience has shattered the illusion of a single, fixed self. What we call I is not a solid entity but a dynamic process, a symphony of neural interactions, constantly shifting, adapting, and reconstructing our identity based on experience. This aligns strikingly with both Jung's and Buddha's perspectives, one pointing to the complexity of the psyche, the other to the impermanence of the self. But what does modern science actually reveal about our sense of self? And how does this knowledge help us break free from suffering? For centuries, philosophers and mystics have questioned the nature of the self. Now, neuroscientists are proving that our identity is not as concrete as we assume. Unlike an organ with a clear function, such as the heart pumping blood, there is no single location in the brain that houses a permanent self. Instead, our sense of identity emerges from multiple neural networks working together, creating a seamless but ultimately illusory experience of continuity. One of the most crucial discoveries in this field is the default mode network, DMN, a system of interconnected brain regions responsible for self-referential thinking. When we reflect on our personal identity, recall memories, or project ourselves into the future, the DMN is highly active. In a sense, this network is the neurological foundation of the ego. It generates the inner monologue, constructs our narrative identity, and keeps us psychologically anchored in the idea that, I am this person, with this past, moving toward this future. But what happens when this network is quieted, or even silenced? This is where the connection between neuroscience and Buddhist practice becomes astonishingly clear. Studies on advanced meditators, Buddhist monks, Zen practitioners, and long-term mindfulness experts, have revealed that deep meditation significantly reduces activity in the DMN. In some cases, it even deactivates it entirely. The result? A state of pure awareness, free from the usual chatter of self-referential thoughts. This correlates precisely with what Buddhist teachings describe as anatta, or no self, the direct realization that the ego is just a mental construct, not an ultimate reality, if the ego is just a mental process. Then what lies beneath it? For Jung, the answer was the collective unconscious, a vast psychological reservoir of symbols, myths, and archetypes shared across all of humanity. He believed that our sense of self is shaped not just by personal experiences but by deep, universal patterns that have existed for millennia. Modern neuroscience supports this idea in surprising ways. Research has shown that across cultures, people dream of similar symbols, tell similar myths, and experience similar psychological struggles. This suggests that our brains are wired to recognize certain universal patterns, whether in storytelling, spirituality, or even personal transformation. What we consider our own identity may, in fact, be a much larger, collective phenomenon. But here's where Jung and Buddha take different approaches. Jung's solution was integration, bringing the unconscious into awareness, acknowledging all aspects of the psyche, and achieving a balanced, whole self. He believed that while the ego was a necessary structure, it should not dominate the psyche. Instead, one should embrace the deeper, archetypal forces within. Buddha's solution was liberation, seeing through the illusion of self entirely, recognizing that there is no one to cling to, and thus freeing oneself from suffering. In his view, attachment to any fixed identity, whether personal or collective, only creates dukkha, the endless cycle of dissatisfaction. Neuroscience, in many ways, bridges these two perspectives. It confirms Jung's idea that identity is psychologically real, a construct shaped by both personal and collective forces. But it also validates Buddha's insight that the self is biologically an illusion, something that can be loosened, or even dissolved, through meditation and mindfulness. From a scientific standpoint, Jung was right, the self is an intricate psychological construct that emerges from deep unconscious patterns. Buddha was right, The self is not a fixed entity, it is impermanent, ever-changing, and ultimately an illusion that can be transcended. But the real question is, what do we do with this knowledge? For most people, the ego feels inescapable. It defines our thoughts, our emotions, and our sense of control. Yet, neuroscience shows that through meditation, mindfulness, and self-inquiry, we can loosen its grip. We can learn to observe our thoughts without identifying with them. We can experience the freedom of letting go, even if just for a moment. Jung and Buddha were not opposing forces but two complementary paths toward the same goal, inner freedom. One through integration, the other through transcendence. And neuroscience, rather than contradicting them, is now proving their wisdom to be more accurate than ever, so perhaps the real question is no longer, who am I, but rather, how much of myself do I truly need? Part 7, How to Apply These Teachings to Everyday Life. The journey of self-discovery is one of the most profound adventures we can embark upon. Both Carl Jung and the Buddha devoted their lives to exploring the nature of the self, and though their approaches differed, they ultimately led to the same destination, freedom. Jung provided us with the tools to integrate the fragmented aspects of our psyche, while the Buddha showed us how to dissolve the illusion of self entirely. But how do we take these lofty philosophical ideas and apply them in our daily lives? How do we move from intellectual understanding to actual transformation? The answer lies in practice. Theoretical knowledge can only take us so far. True change requires direct experience. Here, we will explore three powerful methods that combine Jung's depth psychology with Buddhist mindfulness to create a roadmap for self-liberation. Self-inquiry is the foundation of transformation. Both Jung and the Buddha recognize that much of human suffering comes from the unconscious, the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. Jung called this the shadow, the reservoir of repressed emotions, fears, and desires buried deep within our psyche. The Buddha, on the other hand, taught Vipassana, or insight meditation, a practice of keenly observing the mind without judgment, allowing us to see reality as it is, free from illusion. What happens when we merge these two approaches? We develop an unparalleled ability to witness our own mind with clarity. Try this. Set aside 10 to 15 minutes each day for self-inquiry. You can do this through journaling or silent meditation. Instead of engaging with your thoughts, simply observe them as they arise. Ask yourself, who am I beyond my thoughts and emotions? What unconscious beliefs drive my actions? Which aspects of myself do I reject, and why? At first, this practice can be uncomfortable. You may encounter resistance, anxiety, or even fear. But this is precisely where growth happens. As Jung famously said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. When you shine a light on your shadow, it loses its power over you. One of the greatest sources of suffering in life is our attachment to a fixed identity. We define ourselves by our past experiences, our successes and failures, our roles in society. But what happens when life challenges these identities? A high-achieving professional who loses their job, a devoted parent whose children grow up and move away. When we tie our sense of self to impermanent things, suffering is inevitable. Jung believed in the process of individuation, where we integrate different aspects of our psyche to become a whole, balanced self. However, he also warned against rigid self-identification, which can limit growth. The Buddha took this idea even further, teaching anatta, or the doctrine of no self, the radical insight that the self is an illusion. Imagine you are holding onto a rope tightly. The tighter you grip it, the more your hands hurt. Now, imagine slowly loosening your grip. The tension eases. This is what happens when we stop clinging to a fixed identity. Practice. The next time you feel emotional distress, pause and ask yourself, am I suffering because I am holding on to an idea of who I should be? If you define yourself by your career, reflect on how your worth is independent of external achievements. If you feel trapped by past mistakes, recognize that identity is fluid. You are not the same person you were yesterday. If you struggle with relationships, ask whether your suffering comes from trying to control or attach to a specific role. Letting go does not mean abandoning responsibility, it means freeing ourselves from unnecessary suffering. As the Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, to give your sheep or cow a large, spacious meadow is the way to control him. The less we cling, the freer we become. Modern neuroscience has provided remarkable insights into the nature of selfhood, many of which align perfectly with both Jungian psychology and Buddhist teachings. Studies have shown that there is no single area in the brain responsible for the self. Instead, our identity is a construct, a result of multiple neural networks working together. One of the most significant of these networks is the default mode network, DMN, which is responsible for self-referential thinking, our constant internal monologue about me, myself, and I. Here's where it gets interesting. Overactivity in the DMN is linked to anxiety, depression, and excessive rumination. Long-term meditation has been shown to deactivate the DMN, leading to states of selflessness and deep peace. This aligns perfectly with Jung's theory of transcending the ego and the Buddha's teaching of non-attachment. When we quiet the DMN, we experience reality beyond the chatter of our conditioned mind. Try this. Begin with 5 minutes of daily mindfulness meditation. Sit in a comfortable position, close your eyes, and focus on your breath. Each time a thought arises, simply observe it and let it go. Recognize that no single thought defines you. Over time, this practice rewires the brain, creating new neural pathways that allow us to live with greater clarity, presence, and emotional balance. It is not an escape from reality, it is a return to it. When we integrate Jung's psychological insights with Buddha's spiritual wisdom, we unlock a profound way of being. We understand our unconscious patterns but do not become trapped by them. We embrace our identity but do not cling to it. We experience life fully but do not attach to impermanence. Jung helps us build a stronger, more integrated self. The Buddha helps us transcend it entirely. Both paths lead to freedom, but together, they create something even more powerful, a way of life that is both deeply self-aware and radically unbound. As you move through your day, ask yourself, am I reacting from my conditioned self, or am I observing with awareness? Am I resisting change, or am I flowing with life? Am I trapped in thought, or am I fully present in this moment? The answers to these questions determine whether we remain prisoners of our own minds or step into true liberation. Part 8, The Ultimate Lesson, How This Can Transform Your Life. Transformation is not an abstract concept, it is the very essence of life itself. The cells in your body regenerate, the thoughts in your mind shift like passing clouds, and the beliefs you once held as absolute truth dissolve with experience. If there is one ultimate lesson from the debate between Jung's self and Buddha's no-self, it is this: you are not static. You are not a fixed entity trapped in a singular identity. You are a process, a movement, an unfolding story. And the moment you realize this, true freedom begins. Think about it. How often do we imprison ourselves within rigid narratives? I am not good enough. I am a successful person. I am a failure. I am this type of person, not that type. These labels become chains, binding us to an illusion of permanence. But what happens when we see ourselves as a dynamic process rather than a fixed identity? Suddenly, growth becomes inevitable. Fear of change dissolves. The past loses its grip. Jung understood this deeply. His concept of individuation, the lifelong journey of integrating the conscious and unconscious mind, was not about becoming someone new, but rather about uncovering and embracing the totality of who you already are. It is the process of breaking through self-imposed limitations and seeing yourself beyond the surface of your conditioned mind. The Buddha, on the other hand, took this realization to its ultimate conclusion: if all aspects of the self are fluid, then the self itself must be an illusion. What remains when we drop all attachments to identity? Pure awareness. Liberation. Enlightenment. But let's move beyond theory. How do we live this wisdom? 1. Your identity is not fixed, Embrace impermanence. History is filled with individuals who reinvented themselves by recognizing that identity is not a cage but a fluid construct. Take Siddhartha Gautama himself. Born a prince, he was raised with every imaginable luxury, yet he abandoned his life of privilege to seek truth. Had he clung to the idea of being a prince, the Buddha would never have existed. Similarly, Carl Jung started as a devoted disciple of Freud, only to break away and forge his own groundbreaking path in psychology. His willingness to transcend his earlier identity led to the discovery of the self as a greater, evolving force. Now, ask yourself, what identities are you holding on to that no longer serve you? Are you clinging to a past version of yourself out of fear? Are you limiting your potential because of an old belief about who you should be? The key to growth is embracing change, not as something to fear, but as something natural and necessary, too. True freedom comes from letting go. Both Jung and the Buddha understood that suffering comes from resistance. We resist our emotions, so they control us. We resist our past, so we remain stuck in it. We resist uncertainty, so we live in fear. But what happens when we surrender? When we accept rather than resist? A paradoxical truth emerges: the more we let go, the more we gain. Jung encouraged people to integrate their shadow, the rejected parts of themselves, so they could become whole. But wholeness does not mean control. It means acceptance. Likewise, the Buddha taught that liberation arises not from clinging to identity but from realizing that no identity is permanent. A powerful example of this is found in the story of the samurai and the Zen master. A warrior came to a Zen master and demanded, "Teach me about heaven and hell." The master looked at him and scoffed, "You're nothing but a brute, too stupid to understand anything profound." Enraged, the samurai drew his sword, ready to strike. The master calmly said, "That is hell." The warrior froze, realization dawning. He put down his sword and bowed in gratitude. The master smiled and said, "And that is heaven." This story reveals a profound truth: we create our own suffering through attachment to pride, to ego, to the illusion of control. The moment we let go, peace arises, free. Balance psychology and spirituality for true transformation. We live in a world that often presents a false choice: science or spirituality, logic or intuition, psychology or mysticism. But why choose one when the most profound transformation happens at their intersection? Modern psychology provides us with the tools to understand the mind, while spiritual wisdom provides the means to transcend it. Neuroscience confirms what Buddhism has taught for millennia, that a self is not a singular, unchanging entity. The brain constructs identity through shifting neural patterns, and meditation can literally rewire the brain, loosening the grip of ego-based suffering. Meanwhile, Jungian psychology teaches us how to work with the mind rather than be ruled by it. By integrating these perspectives, we develop not just awareness, but wisdom. Imagine living with both deep self-awareness and total freedom from self-imposed limitations. Imagine navigating life with psychological insight and spiritual clarity, understanding your mind while not being enslaved by it. This is the ultimate integration of Jung's and Buddha's teachings, a way of living that is grounded, yet boundless. Rooted, yet free. So, take a moment now. Breathe. Look within. Ask yourself, what if I am not who I think I am? What if my identity is not a prison, but a path? What if, by letting go of the self, I find something far greater, something limitless, something free? Imagine waking up every day with a mind free from the weight of identity, no longer trapped by past mistakes, future anxieties, or rigid labels. Imagine moving through life with the deep, unshakable peace that comes from knowing you are not just your thoughts, your achievements, or your fears. This is the freedom that both Jung and Buddha pointed to, each in their own way. Now, it's your turn to take the first step. Start by observing your thoughts. Are they reinforcing a fixed identity, or are they allowing you to grow and evolve? Begin questioning the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Are they serving you, or are they keeping you stuck? And most importantly, explore what happens when you let go. Even just for a moment, of the need to define yourself at all, we are building a community of seekers, people who dare to question, to grow, and to transcend the limitations of the self. If this message resonated with you, let us know in the comments. Do you resonate more with Jung's path of individuation or Buddha's path of no self? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries of the mind, consciousness, and Zen wisdom. Together, let's uncover the truths that lead to real transformation, because true liberation begins the moment you stop clinging to an illusion.